Now I'm going to share screen. So hello, everyone. I am about to share screen here. And this is the chapter 5. We're doing chapter 5 and 6 of Jewish history today, which means we're going to talk about the start of Christianity, and we're going to talk about the start of Rabbinic Judaism. So it's a pretty monumental time period in history. There's a lot to talk about. So I think you'll enjoy it, hopefully. I have a few pictures of Israel because I like, what do you put up for the pictures of early Christianity or early Rabbinic Judaism? There aren't any like iStock photo pictures of, which is where I get most of these, of like ancient Babylonia. So you'll have to make do with travel pictures. These are pictures of like, like, believe it or not, the last time I went to Israel, it's been a little while. Because of COVID, but this is a view from the Jerusalem Museum. It's a beautiful little site there, though, isn't it? So I figured I'd put up Jerusalem. Why not? Okay, so where we pick up our story, where we pick up our narrative is Judaism and Christianity. As I said, this is the place where the two part ways. And what's happening is Roman rule over Judea. This is a bit of review. Was in a time of great turmoil. We had just talked about Herod's reign, about the building of the Second Temple. The Second Temple had actually been standing, but he like rebuilt it. And so the building that you go see, if you go to the ruins of the ancient temple, is Herod's rebuilding. And what's left of it is the retaining walls, which are pretty massive. You get a pretty good sense of how big it is. One of the things that they do with it, interestingly enough, is offset it by about that much, so that each brick is inward a little bit. That both makes it much more stable. So that's why those walls are still there, and despite earthquakes and the like in the region. But also, it means when you look up it, you can from the base of it, you can see the whole thing as opposed to it towering over you. When you try to look at the top of a skyscraper, you'll notice it kind of feels like, you can't quite see it. If you make it inset like that, then it's possible to see the whole thing. One of those funny little building details. And remember that they do this massive project without the benefit of cranes or some of the tools that we would want to use. They roll them, the bricks, they mine them, roll them, and then set them in place, partly using sand. So, okay. So there was also going on the conflict between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. We talked about that. We talked also about the Essenes and the Sicarii. So there were two major Jewish rebellions, and of course the destruction of the Second Temple. We're going to cover a little bit of that today. So we're overlapping a bit of last week's lecture, because there's a lot that's going on. So it depends on which thing you're going to focus on. Last week's was focusing on rule of the area. This week is talking about how Judaism and Christianity pull apart from each other. So here's our timeline. 4 BCE, Jesus is born. They make it sound like it's just completely known that this is his birth date. Actually, it's just a scholarly consensus is 4 BCE, but it's somewhere in there. Around 26 CE, John the Baptist preaches and baptizes his followers. And then around 33 CE, Jesus is arrested and crucified by the Roman governor of Judea. So he's expected to be, 29-ish. That's at this point. Around 50 CE, Paul begins to teach his interpretation of Christian beliefs. So Paul actually becomes Christian about 20 years after Jesus' death, and doesn't know him personally. That I think is important. 60 to 90 CE is when the Gospels are written. So they're written well after his death, by people who, in some cases, may have been there, but not always. Around 73 CE, some Christians developed the belief that Christianity is meant to replace Judaism. This is called supersessionism. And then in the 300s CE, Christianity becomes the official religion of the Roman Empire. And so it becomes a lot more popular. And there's a lot of reasons for that. So we're going to go into a little bit of that. Okay. Questions so far?
One question, Rabbi.
Yes.
Why were dates changed so that they were using BCE and CE? What caused that change?
Oh, instead of doing BC and AD?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Because BC and AD, AD is Anno Domini, the year of our Lord, and BC, I don't remember what it stands for, but it's before Christ, basically. Whereas these are less Christological. It's still the Christian calendar, but it's used as a secular calendar as well. And so to take out the Christological references, what they do is say BCE is before Common Era, and CE is Common Era, ERA, Common Era,
Oh,
just to make it less Christological. There's a couple other, and that it's a good question because there's a couple other places where it's common in scholarship to make these substitutions to make it less Christological. For example, one of the things is that when you talk about the Christian Bible, you say Christian Bible instead of New Testament, because New and Old Testament is supersessionist, or
mhm,
implies supersessionism. So instead you say Hebrew Bible, Christian Bible. And that's one of the other places where you can make this distinction. And then
mhm.
to return the favor, that's one of the reasons why I refer to the people who wrote the Bible as Israelites rather than Jews, because I think actually, my point of view is that the two groups kind of develop in both are continuations of the Israelites, but in different ways. And the idea that Christianity is birthed from Judaism, it is in some ways, yes, but also is its own religion at the same time. So out of the Israelite. So that's part of the reason why I make those distinctions, is to help make it easier to figure out, who we are talking about and what happened. Because the Israelites are the ones who worship at the temple, whereas the Jews are the ones who are the inheritors of the rabbinic literature, of the rabbinic way of looking at things. And you'll even
Right.
see there's a group that comes out that is neither Christian nor Jewish, the Karaites, who are closer in relationship to the Christians, I mean, to the Jews, but at the same time are not rabbinic. They don't accept the authority of the rabbis. So like there's multiple groups coming out of this time frame, if that makes sense. Of the various groups, the one that's the most successful in obtaining followers is Christianity, and you'll see some of the reasons for that. Okay, so we start out with John the Baptist, a Jewish man named Yochanan, which is how you say John in Hebrew, known to history as John the Baptist. The John name, that's comes from the Greek, because the Christian scriptures are written in Greek. Warned that the end of days was near and that sinners would not be permitted to enter into God's kingdom. So John creates a new ritual, which becomes known as baptism. It's based on the Jewish ritual of mikvah, which is dunking of the entire body in water. John taught that repentance purifies people of their sins, and that baptism is the outward sign of that purification. And the mikvah is something. A lot of the mikvaot in the area around the temple area, you can still see them. You can go sit in them if you want. I mean, they don't have water in them anymore, but they're out there and you can go sit in them. There's a picture. I have a picture of my dad sitting in one, as if he were sitting at some sort of spa. And what happens is that those required payment, of course. And John's doing this in natural bodies of water, so there's a little bit of this. Anti-elitism, anti-profiteering from purification rituals as well. And you see this actually, Jesus of Nazareth, one of the followers of John, was a man named Jesus. It's really a variation on, Jesus is the Greek version of it. It's a variation on the word Joshua, Yeshua, Yehoshua. Yeshua is probably how it would be pronounced in Aramaic in the area at the time. And so sometimes you will see people like with tattoos that says Yeshua on them. So I can't tell you how many times I've seen a tattoo and had one of the people with me say, ask me, what's it say? And I'm like, Jesus. That's a Jesus tattoo, but in Hebrew letters. So after he was baptized, Jesus became a traveling preacher. And like John, he urged people to repent. He also spoke out against greed and unjust treatment of the poor. And what little we know of the life of Jesus comes from stories written after his death. We also know that actually at the time that the the priesthood was corrupt, like because on account of Rome was auctioning it off to the highest bidder, so to speak. Whoever was willing to pay the largest bribe got to be the high priest. And that had been going on for quite some time. So yeah, I'm going to turn off. I got somebody who's got their. I'm going to mute all right now. Okay. I hit mute all, so you're going to have to unmute yourself to ask a question. Sorry about that, but somebody had background noise, so I'm just doing that. No worries there. But at any rate, what happens is that we do know that the priesthood had been auctioned off to the highest bidder. That's the Romans' fault. And as a result, it was quite corrupt. And so it's not a surprise that you have preachers preaching against the priesthood. Remember also the Essenes had thought that eventually the end of days was going to come, that the sons of light were going to defeat the sons of darkness, and they retreat to the desert to live sort of monastic, monk-like life, celibate and not particularly celebratory, very, very ascetic. So these are some of the things that are going on. It feels like everybody keeps feeling like the end of days is near. They really do. Something about the time makes them feel that way. So what happens to the individual Jesus is that he is arrested and executed. Now, one of the things to know is that a lot of this stuff, there's not a lot of extra biblical, like the outside of the Christian Bible, not a lot of material supporting the narrative, simply because it doesn't show up in Roman stuff, for example. And I do actually tend to believe that what happens to him is probably true in the sense of the arrest and execution, partly because it wouldn't be made up. You wouldn't make that up. So it's probably true. Around 33 CE, according to Christian tradition, Jesus heads to Jerusalem in the weeks before the festival of Passover. He spoke to large crowds at the temple, rivaling the crowds in overturning stalls and tables of merchants and money changers. The high priest Caiaphas, and remember how the way you become the priest is by bribing someone or paying a fee. And other Jewish leaders were angered, someone Roman, paying a fee to the Romans. And other Jewish leaders were angered by Jesus' criticism and were concerned that the people preparing for Passover might try to rebel against the Romans. The Roman procurator Pontius Pilate was a man who used brutal tactics to crush even a hint of rebellion. He had done that several times. So Jesus was arrested and handed over to Pilate, who condemned him to death and executed him by crucifixion. The Christian Bible doesn't make him Pilate the primary villain in the story, but in terms of the power that he would have held, he's the one who would have made that decision. The narrative in the Christian Bible reflects some of the polemic of the later years. Remember, it's written later, and it says that it's the Pharisees who have the power at that time to make the decision. It's wrong about that. The Pharisees had become the power brokers by the year 60 to 90 CE, but in the at the time of Jesus' arrest and execution, they're not in charge. It's the Sadducees. So keep in mind that the narrative in the Christian Bible does not reflect the actual power dynamics of the era that it occurs, but rather reflects the polemic environment some 30 to 40 years later, if that makes sense. Are there any questions about that? Because I think it's an important point, partly because by blaming the Jews for the death of Jesus sets up some of the violence between that Christians eventually inflict upon Jews for having killed Jesus, when it wasn't. That's not an accurate reflection of the power dynamics of the era, if that makes sense. Questions about that? And you'll have to unmute yourself because I muted everybody. So no questions? Because if you're speaking out, I can't hear you.
The Sadducees were a group of Jews
Yeah, there are really Israelites. I mean, we're still not quite yet to Jews yet. But yeah, Sadducees were the priestly class, basically the elites, and the Sadducees are the ones who are in charge at the time of Jesus's death. But the Pharisees, who eventually become the rabbis, are not in charge. They only become in charge when the temple is destroyed in the year 70. So at the time that Jesus lives, it's the Sadducees who Caiaphas comes from the Sadducees, not from the Pharisees. But when the Christian Bible gets written in the years, like 60 to 90, they've lost sight of that, or they're just simply, trying to frame the Pharisees because they don't like them, because it's a rival group. So the two groups write nasty things about each other in their early Gospels or their early Talmudic materials. Yeah, they're not nice to each other, and that's unfortunate. Um, and because the Christian group is the one that has the most power, the violence tends to be Christian to Jewish instead of Jewish to Christian. One of the other reasons for the other thing to keep in mind is that there was also in this era a decision to be made, and each group made its own decision and disliked or disapproved of the decision of the other. And that is, are you going to work with the Romans, or are you going to work against the Romans? Because the Romans, of course, are brutal. You see here Pontius Pilate will use brutal tactics to crush even a hint of rebellion. And I'd mentioned in earlier conversations and lectures that they would do things like bury vestal virgins alive if there was a hint of them having had relations, just whether or not it was true. And that is the kind of just callous brutality that they would do. So and I have my own, like I have my biases. I prefer the rabbis, right? The rabbis were offended by this and didn't want to be part of the Romans, didn't want to pursue that line of power. And eventually what happens is the Christian group does. As you can see, the Christian group, it becomes the Holy Roman Empire. You saw in our last slide. Where am I? Right here. See, oops, not our last slide, in our timeline, in the 300s, it becomes the official religion of the Roman Empire. That's when it becomes the Holy Roman Empire. So that gives you some idea of what happens, okay? Okay, here's where we're at now. Questions? Okay. So what happens is we go from Jesus to Christ. Christ is a word for is the related to the Greek word Christos, which is Messiah. So that's why Jews don't refer to Jesus as Christ. When Christians say Jesus Christ, they're saying Jesus is the Messiah, and Jews will say, of course, Jesus is not the Messiah. So that's why we don't use the word. We don't call him Christ. It's a title. Okay. His supporters came to believe that Jesus was not only an earthly king, but also a spiritual king, and that the end of days would soon arrive. Over time, Jesus' followers began to identify themselves as a separate community. The community became known as Christians from the Greek word Christos, which means Messiah. At first, it's possible to be both Christian and Jewish, but two factors led to a complete break. So we'll get to that in a second. Here, actually, in this picture, you can see three world religions all at the same time. This is the Western Wall, which is, where that's why there's a bunch of buses right here as tourists are going into that area. You see the Dome of the Rock, which is Islamic, and then that is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. So three major world religions right there. Really important sites. So, and really cool to go see. So some point where I'll be able to go back and travel to Israel and go see that. Questions? Okay, I got to move forward. Paul. So around 50 CE, a Jew named Paul of Tarsus, began to teach that Gentiles need not to convert to Judaism or follow Jewish law in order to become Christians. So for example, they didn't need to circumcise, which made it possible for people who were not circumcised to become part of this religion. The belief that Jesus died for one's sins and the performance of Christian rituals such as baptism were considered enough. And so they didn't have to also try to keep kosher. Paul sought new followers in the diaspora, founding and supporting Christian communities in cities along the not Easter, although Easter probably, I suppose, works too. Eastern coast of the Mediterranean. I actually went back and proofread, but I missed that one. And then he wrote letters called epistles to these communities. These epistles become part of the Christian Bible. So the epistles of Paul are a section in the Christian Bible. So what happens is the Christian Bible has Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, First and Second Corinthians, first and like it goes through. What happens is it starts with the Gospels of the disciples who followed Jesus around, who knew him personally, although they may not have been, the accounts may or may not have been written by the men that they're named for. And then you have the letters of Paul, basically. That's usually by the name of the location, so Corinthians or Romans or that sort of thing. And what happens is, actually, the interesting thing is that the set of gospels that are from his immediate followers, they don't all quite line up and agree on all of the details of his life. So it's something that people, what happens is that similar to like when you talk about some of the narratives in the Hebrew Bible, it won't necessarily, if you try to chart it or say this is what happens next, you'll discover that they're actually discrepancies, but the narrative sort of smooths it out. So the story of Jesus's birth and the story of Jesus's crucifixion will vary from gospel to gospel, actually. Okay, and I keep stopping for questions just in case, but most of the time you haven't had any, which is fine. Yes.
Rabbi.
Yes.
Some of the books of the gospel had changed because of, I think, Christian leaders in the past, tried to merge together and create a Bible. Now, I'm not a specialist in this,
Right.
but I'm wondering if some of these, if they were a lot more differences between them, and everything was smoothed over to fit.
Could be. It's possible. A lot of times with canonical literature that becomes canon or becomes, like religious literature, it's not uncommon to have a redactor who goes through and smooths things out. And so, yeah, it's very possible. Also not my particular area of expertise, so I can't tell you for sure, but I think you're right. But I do know that they are written enough after his life that that's part of the reason why they don't quite line up, is that, it's hard to say. Okay. Other questions about Paul? This is also where, if you've ever heard the phrase, the scales fell from our eyes, or, like that kind of, that's a Paul thing. He's on his way to persecute, according to the Christian's description of his story and his own description, the new Christian sect, and he, on his travels, suddenly realizes the truth of Christianity, has a conversionary moment, and the scales fall from his eyes. So if you ever hear that phrase, it's referring to Paul specifically, and it's a specifically Christian image of converting from Judaism to Christianity. Okay, I'm going to continue. Breaking away. So the Jewish revolt from 66 to 73 confronted Jewish Christians with the same question it confronted all other Jews. Why had God permitted the destruction of the temple, God's dwelling place? Jewish Christians came to believe that God was punishing the Jews for rejecting Jesus as the promised Messiah. So here's another piece of that successionary narrative. And you notice the timing also, that if the Christian Bible is written starting in about 60 to about 90, so you can see the time frame and why. Like what's the motivation for setting these things down? Well, to establish this group as separate and as not part of the revolt, right? Because the Bar Kokhba revolt further distanced Jewish Christians from the Jewish community, as Christians already had a Messiah and did not need Bar Kokhba, because remember that people like Akiva are referring to Bar Kokhba, that Bar Kokhba is actually a nickname, as the Messiah, the son of the star. And notice also, actually, there's a little subtle thing going on in there, or not so subtle. Son of a star. What was the, like, what's one of the Christmas carols that people sang, about stars? Does any of that ring a bell? Is there a star thing in the Christian narrative? Anyone?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, son of a star, huh? Yeah, we've got a Messiah with a star too, right? He's son of a star. So part of, you hear that there's actually a bit of polemic going on. Does that make sense? Because remember, the three kings are supposed to have followed a star to get to Jesus, to the main, so that's where that's coming in. So the two groups are having a family squabble. They don't like each other. They're going to eventually split. This, by the way, is the big model of the ancient temple that's at the Israel Museum. It had originally been at the Holy Land Hotel, but the Holy Land Hotel went defunct. And so happily, they moved the whole diorama to the Israel Museum, which is convenient for travel, for seeing it, because then you can just spend longer time at the Jewish Museum and not have to schlep out to the Holy Land Hotel. It's a cool diorama, because like this thing is huge, by the way. It's not full size, of course, but it's the diorama. Trying to think about how big it is. The whole diorama would fit in our social hall at the temple, but only barely. So it's a pretty big diorama, to give you an idea. It's remarkably detailed too. Okay, so that's that was chapter 5, the birth of Christianity. Questions before I move on to chapter 6?
Oh, I just want to say I went through 9 years at Catholic school and I didn't learn any of that.
Oh my goodness, yeah.
I was gonna call and ask for a refund.
Fair enough. Yeah, no, yeah, and one of the things that well, part of it is because what you're learning is the narrative that's been smoothed over, and we do, like in Jewish tradition, we do that too. They're not wrong for doing that, because they're trying to have you understand how to think about it in a way that makes sense. But the historian's role is to start, and that's why we're working from the Jewish history, the big experience, the big picture, is to start pulling out some of those certainties and opening up, here's the places where that grand narrative breaks down, where it's not true. And like we have that, if you think about it, you have the same kind of thing happen with, say, American history. There'll be things that parts of the American history grand narrative where if you get into the history of it, you start questioning it. So I would go easy on them, but I get what you're saying, though.
No, I'm going after St. Teresa's The Little Flower of Jesus elementary school.
Okay.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, so let's talk about what happens. So that's the path that the Jewish Christians who eventually become just simply Christians are, and this is part of the reason why we say that you can't be Jewish and Christian, is the two really do split. They like that you can't be both, like because what happens is they have a very different set of theologies. What emerges from the Jewish Christian experience, what becomes Christianity, is the idea that Jesus is the Messiah, that Jesus died for your sins, that you needed that because you couldn't possibly do all of the commandments, that and in fact, it's appropriate to abandon most of the commandments, things like, circumcision and kashrut and all of that. But you could do the 10 commandments, and that eventually Jesus will come back and well, what happens when Jesus comes back is kind of muddled. Like there's not a clear answer to precise. I don't have a clear understanding of there. You have like those novels about rapture where people are supposed to like suddenly ascend to the sky, but I'm like, So does that end of, I'm not clear. End of days? I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I guess so. Not to say that the Jewish understanding of end of days is any less muddled. We don't, like in both cases, you'll have a lot of different narratives about it, a lot of different, discussions about it, and not necessarily a clear, singular, this is what happens. Like ask what Jews think is the end of days, and you come up with a lot of this sort of, well, everybody will be gathered to Israel, all of the Jews, and then and you're like, and then what? And then it's like, well, everybody gets gathered to Israel. Okay, and then what? Well, there's a resurrection of the dead in there somewhere. You're like, okay, and then what? And then, like, it's the end of days. So none of the end of days stuff is going to be like that logical or easily understood, or like, this is what it looks like, if that makes sense. That eschatological stuff, that's the fancy word for end of days, tends to be that kind of muddled thing of, okay. Anyway, let's go to Babylonia. So after the disastrous Bar Kokhba revolt, because it was really, abject failure, as Christianity spread through the Roman Empire, many Jews left Judea in hopes of a better life. So that's a period of 200 years, of course, because you have because in the 300s is about when it becomes the Holy Roman Empire, but Christianity is spreading before this point. It's not like all of a sudden everybody just converted in the year 300. It's actually that Christianity was spreading and spreading, and then eventually it becomes the Holy Roman Empire. So many of the Jews, and now we can start talking about them as Jews, because it's not just Israelites. This is a specific group. Many moved north to the Galilee or to Syria. Others traveled east to Babylonia, where Jews had lived for generations after the destruction of the first temple. Jewish life in the Galilee eventually weakened because of the intolerance of the Roman Empire's Christian leaders. And as the Galilee declined in Jewish population influence, Babylonia became more powerful. And so what this picture is, why I have it, is you'll notice that's the Talmud. We're going to move into the Talmudic literature. What this is a set of Mishnah. This is a picture from my office of at the temple. So this is a set of Mishnah that I have here, and then what I have here is a set of Talmud Bavli. That's what it says, Talmud Bavli, and the different tractates. Although interestingly enough, I have not arranged them in order of their tractates. They're just sort of randomly on there because I pull them out all the time. So at some point I should put them in the proper order, but I have not.
Rabbi, what are tractates?
Tractates are the different books. It's a way of saying books of the Talmud. And you will also notice, if you let me see if I actually, I'm not sure you can see that there's a one-to-one here. These are the different tractates of the Talmud. The names here become the names of the various tractates. What happens is they take the Mishnah and expand upon it in the Talmud Bavli, in the Babylonian Talmud. So, okay, well, we'll move forward with the timeline and I'll come back to that idea. I'll explain that in a minute. So here's our timeline. Around 200, the Mishnah is completed. The Mishnah is essentially a commentary on the Bible, but it's a legal commentary on the Bible. It's written in very clear Hebrew. It's redacted by Rabbi Judah the Prince. It's done in the land of Israel. And as I said, around the year 200. Around the year 400, the Palestinian Talmud is completed. The Palestinian Talmud uses a different technique of writing about these things than the Jerusalem Talmud, the Babylonian Talmud. Palestinian Talmud, by the way, is also called the Jerusalem Talmud because it starts in Jerusalem. Around 500, Babylonian, not Babylonia Talmud, but Babylonian, I occasionally make those mistakes. Oops, not helpful. Okay, is completed. And that's the one that's authoritative. And how it's structured is you take a Mishnah, because the Mishnah is broken down into like little paragraphs, right? So like you have Mishnah 1, a little paragraph that says this is how you're going to do something. For example, in the Mishnah tractate Peah meaning corners, it refers to the laws related to the corners of the field. And so what happens is the first one will tell you, I should have pulled it up and so I could read it to you exactly, but it'll tell you things like how much of your field needs to be devoted to this, or whether or not the poor can organize to come and do it together, or if the individual poor people have to do it, or if they can sell the produce from taking the corners of the field. This is all related to taking the corner, leaving it for the corners of the field for the poor, and whether or not how the poor can access it and what they can do with it, if that makes sense. So the Mishnah will explain. Let me take one step back, because I think I've gone too far without explaining myself here. The Bible will tell you corners of your field belong to the poor. Don't take them, not yours. Okay, great. Everybody clear? And the Mishnah is like, well, okay, wait a minute. I have a question. If the poor organize, can they still take the corners of the field? Can the poor come anytime they want to? Can the poor sell the materials and then buy something else with it, or do they have to eat it themselves? These are important questions. The Bible's like, I don't know. The Bible doesn't tell you. And so what happens is the Mishnah will go through and explain each of these points. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So what happens is that the Mishnah explains these points, but unfortunately, even if you say, yeah, the poor can organize, then they say, okay, there's more to go with that, right? And so the Babylonian Talmud is an elaboration on the Mishnah. So you have the Bible, and then the Mishnah explains the Bible, and then the Gemara explains the Mishnah. And those things together become the Talmud. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. The other thing that happens in this period of time is around 570, Muhammad, the prophet of Islam, is born in Mecca. And in 638, Jerusalem comes under Muslim control. And in 642, Babylonia, the center of Jewish life, comes under Muslim control. And then the other thing in our timeline is in 882, Sadia Ganaon is born in Egypt. We'll get to who he is, because you probably haven't heard of him. Okay, questions so far?
Question about the Gemara. So that
Mhm.
comes after the Mishnah.
Yes.
What is in the Gemara specifically?
Sometimes it's an explanation of the Mishnah. Sometimes it's a folk tale or a cure or a joke. I mean, they wander. So
Okay.
it's all kinds of stuff. Like I was working in recently on the tractate Yoma, which is related to repentance. The day Yoma means day of atonement, Yom Kippur. Yom, it's the day. It's the Aramaic word for the day. And so the Mishnah will be like this. In order to get repentance, a person has to satisfy his fellow before they can have achieve atonement with God. Great. They go on to explain what that means and go into much greater detail. Things like, well, if a rabbi doesn't pay this butcher, that's a much bigger deal than and they go on and on.
Okay.
Okay, so the Talmud. In 219 CE, the Babylonian sage Rav, who had spent years studying in Palestine with Rabbi Judah the Prince, returned to Babylonia. So he goes back to Babylonia, and the rabbis of Babylonia start studying the Mishnah with great excitement. They were really into it, and so their method. In the case, as I said, the Palestinian Talmud, they just wander all over the place, and it's not clear how it's organized in regard to the Mishnah. Whereas with the Talmud, they're actually fairly disciplined about Mishnah, or they are disciplined about this, with very few exceptions. There are a couple tractates that don't follow this pattern, but most of them follow the pattern of Mishnah, Gemara. The Mishnah says something, Gemara explains it. And the Mishnah, is what they brought back from the land of Israel from Rabbi Judah the Prince, that was redacted in about the year 200. In 219, it makes its way to Babylonia, and the Babylonians just go nuts. They think this is the greatest thing ever, and they record their discussions of it. The Gemara has a feeling of sort of transcription of notes of the sort of wandering conversation that they have. And that's part of the reason why it has folk cures and jokes and asides, and all that reminds me of a story. And because it does kind of read a bit like transcripts in that regard. And then Rav Papa said, and then Rav, like they each have these conversations. It might not be actually like in the room conversations, because in some cases you see multiple generations in it, so it might be additions as well. It's not just a straight up transcription, if that makes sense, but it kind of feels like one. The other thing that happens with Talmud is that with Gemara, I mean, is that sometimes you will have a situation where they'll have the Mishnah and then they'll be aware of alternate rulings or alternate traditions, if that makes sense. The Mishnah will say you do it at this hour, or the Mishnah might preserve there's a difference of opinion between two rabbis on this. What's the right hour to recite the Shema? Or does atonement, can you achieve atonement simply by asking for forgiveness, or do you need to do other things as well? Like these kinds of questions, right? Or it could be very small things, or it can be very big questions, but they'll have, this one says this and this one says that. And the Talmud in the Gemara, what will happen is they'll work to resolve these two by saying this one's right in this situation and this one's right in that situation. Does it make sense? They'll always find it, they're always both right. Or nearly always. So there's probably exceptions where they're like, nope, that one's wrong. But most of the time what happens is if they have variant traditions, they'll figure out a way that he was talking about this situation and he was talking about that situation, and that's why they're both right. And so a good portion of it is them just figuring out how to make sense of variant traditions. Does that make sense? That's part of the reason why when they say if you want to learn how to reason things, look at Talmud. It's actually pretty sophisticated in how it goes about reasoning. And figure and it's both and in a lot of cases, which is a fascinating way to handle, because one of them will say X is true and one of them will say not X is true. They'll literally be opposites and they'll figure out a way to make the opposites work. Fascinating stuff. And it's part of the reason why the two Jews, three opinions is a saying, is that the Talmud is part of it. Two Jews, three opinions, right? 1, 2, and they're both right. Questions?
Rabbi, the Orthodox Jews who study all day, what is it that they are studying?
Usually, more often than not, it varies a little bit, but the most common is Daf Yomi. And what Daf Yomi means is the page of the day. And that is the Talmud page of the day. And there's always a Talmud page of the day, and they go through it takes about 7 years to go through an entire Talmud page of the day. If you look it up, you can find out what it is. And everybody's studying the same page. That's usually it. And a page is enough. The page is pretty big, and there's a lot of, it's fairly detailed because you can follow, there's commentaries on it, and you could look up the biblical verses and you could look up all of the halachic law. So you could spend a day on it. The other thing that they might be studying is the words of their own rabbi, like especially like Chabad will study Schneerson's words, that sort of thing. And they might study Kabbalah, is another thing that people can really spend a lot of time studying. But the true traditional thing, Daf Yomi. And there are, by the way, liberal Daf Yomi groups out there. When it started up this most recent time, I was working here and I was like, I do not have time right now. So I was tempted to start it up, but it's like, yeah, no. So at some point I'll follow Dafyomi and do a 7-year stint of it, but I didn't have time to put that kind of time into it right now. Because even if you just do it as a knowing what the stuff is, that's still like just reading it is going to take you 30 minutes to untangle it. You can read the page in less than that, but to untangle the little knots in it and have a sense of what it said would take would take at least 30 minutes. And to go into deeper would take more. So, okay.
Okay.
Yeah, good question though. The rabbis of Babylonia studied the Mishnah with great excitement. Many of these discussions are recorded in the Babylonian Gemara, written mostly in Aramaic, by the way. Part of the reason why it's a little bit challenging. I find the Aramaic of the Talmud just teeth breaking. It's really hard. But meanwhile, similar conversations were going on in Tiberias, the other rabbinic centers in the Galilee. The discussions in the Galilee were also compiled. They were known as the Palestinian Talmud, also called the Jerusalem Talmud. It's interesting because I've encountered the name Jerusalem more commonly than Palestinian, so I'm not sure why this book uses Palestinian, but both are the same. The Palestinian Talmud was completed around 400 CE, and the Babylonian Gemara continued to be edited and expanded into the 6th century. So past that point. Because what happens is that life gets hard, in the Galilee, and so they stop, and whereas things continue in Babylonia for a much longer period of time. The challenge of Islam. In the first half of the 7th century, Arab armies swept out of Arabia and conquered most of the lands where Jews were living. Muhammad and his successors waged war against their neighbors, capturing Jerusalem in 638, Babylonia in 642, and Spain in 711. In Babylonia and elsewhere, Muslims were usually granted Jews the right to practice their religion without interference, recognizing Jews and Christians as people of the book, though it was a second-class status. So, for example, there were limits on how high a synagogue could be built or what kinds of swords. I think that there was a special ceremonial sword the Jews couldn't carry, or that kind of stuff, just to make sure that they understood that they were second-class citizens. Same goes for Christians. Something that a lot of people in the US are not familiar with is the idea that Islam actually incorporates the holy books of Jews and Christians. So it has the full Bible as part of its tradition, in addition to the Quran, and treats it as a holy book. And that's part of the reason why though second class status, it was still a higher class than other, than pagans or people who, Zoroastrians or something. And they would not persecute them to the same level. And in Spain, actually, what happens is that the golden age of Spain is during the time that the Muslims are in charge. And what happens is, we'll see that in our next, no, not yet. What happens is that Arabic became the primary language across the Middle East, and Jews started producing books in Arabic and Judeo-Arabic, which used Hebrew letters. And so there's a lot of stuff going on that's really of a high level, partly because, for example, all of the Greek works, things like Plato and Aristotle, get translated into Arabic, and that's how the Jews come in contact with it, is through Arabic translations of Plato and Aristotle, and also Plotinus and the like. And so this becomes a thing, it becomes the science of the day, and there's a sort of flowering of knowledge and understanding. They do grammars, they do poetry, they write in Hebrew and in Arabic. Maimonides is part of this. He's born in Spain. He eventually moved. Things turn less positive in later years. He's born in Spain, in Cordova, and then moves to Egypt. So we'll get to him later. But he writes in both Hebrew and in Arabic, and Judeo-Arabic. And so this is a period of great activity. Questions about that? Okay, I'm going to move on. Saadia Gaon. Saadia, born in Egypt in 882, he studied in Israel, in Israel. See, I try to get these, but I even read it again. Yeah, you see why it's a problem. Okay, he studied in Israel and Babylonia before becoming the Gaon of the Babylonian Academy in Sura. There were academies in Sura and Pumbedita. He lived until 942, and he translated most of the Bible into Arabic. Now you see why he would do that. Why would he want to translate it into Arabic? Because they wouldn't necessarily know Hebrew. Most of the Jewish world was speaking Arabic at the time. And he produced a prayer book with Arabic and explanations. He wrote the first Hebrew grammar book, a Hebrew dictionary, and Hebrew poetry. But his most important work was the Book of Beliefs and Opinions, in which he showed how one could believe both the Torah and Greek philosophers. Now you see why he needed to do that, right? Like why the Greek philosophers were actually a bit of a challenge for folks. And so and he gets quoted in my book, when I do the medieval sections on it. Now he's one of the ones that I quote in the medieval section. So though he's on the edge of the ancient world, he got kind of included in medieval. He's just at the start of the medieval period in 882. Okay. Questions? Okay, we're getting to our last slide, but we're getting to the last 5 minutes, so our timing's good. And that'll mean that if you have any last questions that you've been holding up, you can ask, like on the larger scale. Okay, the Karaite challenge. The Karaites, are Jews influenced by Islam. So they're Jewish in the sense that they do take a lot of, they don't go the Christian route. They don't take Jesus as Messiah. They're not in that whole theological structure. They're much closer to Judaism, but they follow only the explicit teachings of the Torah rather than the interpretations of the rabbis. So they denied the authority of the Talmud, the Exilarch, who is the political leader of the Babylonian Jews, and the Gaonim, the heads of the academies. They just say all of that's not valid. And Anan bin David, born sometime in the 8th century, he was this learned, pious, and very strict individual. And after his death, he becomes the guiding light of the Karaites. They use him as their sage. And the rabbis permitted Jews, here's one of the places where there's a difference between them. The rabbis permit Jews to keep a fire burning throughout Shabbat, so long as it was lit beforehand. So if it starts beforehand and then dies down, that's fine. Whereas the Karaites say, no, you must put out your fire before Shabbat starts. So this is actually, like one of the main big things to know right here. This is why we light candles at the start of Shabbat, right here. Why? You light your candles partly to say, I am a rabbinite. I follow the rabbis. That's why they made it. That's right there. Why do we do that? To prove we're not Karaites. I mean, it's not the only reason, but it's a big part of it. Because if you think about it, why would you light candles to start Shabbat? I mean, the wine makes sense. The challah makes sense. The wine to gladness, the challah because you got to eat. You're going to eat a meal. It's almost time for dinner. You're going to do blessings. That all makes sense. Why do we light candles? Well, of course, it makes a nice meal, but it's partly to say, we let fire, if you light a fire before the Shabbat starts, we'll let it burn, and that's okay, because we're rabbinites. Ha! You learn something new. Anyway, by the 16th century, the rabbis originally, they were actually really just Jews, like in the sense of they were just a sect of Jews. By the 16th century, the rabbis had decreed that the Jews could not marry Karaites. Yet the community lived on, and most of its 35,000 adherents reside in Israel today. So they still exist, but they're not that big, and they still think they're right. Questions?
I have a question about the geography.
Yes.
So like at this time, so it's been 700, 800 years almost since the destruction of the Second Temple. And
right.
So is it, and the diaspora has taken place.
Yes.
Are there still Jews in Israel?
Yes.
Or yes. Okay.
Yes.
And then everyone else is like in Spain and
right.
Egypt.
The Romans kicked the Jews out of Jerusalem and only let them re-enter on Tisha B'Av for a while. But in the rest of it, like there were still Jews in the Galilee, for example. So that community is continuous. And they return to Jerusalem as soon as they can. So it's that's an old community as well. But yes, there were Jews still in the Galilee. Many of them left because it was, basically wasn't a good place to be. That it's a hard climate anyway. So poverty is not common, and like just if you have a drought year, it's a hard place to live. But yes, there's always folks who are like absolutely tied to the land. So, other questions? I'm going to take off my screen sharing. Okay. So yeah, but hopefully what I have answered is that, like I've explained the origin of three world religions, right? This is where Judaism comes from. This is where Christianity comes from, where Islam comes from. And the three of them have distinct theological structures. So this is sort of where I'll bring it to a close. Judaism takes the idea that the Torah, the Hebrew Bible, is canon, and expands on it in the direction of the Talmud, and uses the Torah as a basis of both Jewish law and also of Jewish practice, and tries to find ways to be continuous with the sacrificial system by having verbal prayer in its place, by having kashrut, which is the laws of kosher, and by study. It's a very academic approach. Also by being very anti-power in a sense, like there's a definite strain of this, the brutality of what it takes to run an empire we want nothing of. The Christian group takes the theology that Jesus was the Messiah and died for our sins, that by having died for our sins, you no longer have to do all of the laws of Judaism, and in fact could join without doing things like circumcision or keeping kosher, and that it wasn't in fact possible to follow all of those laws. The laws were a burden instead of a delight, as the Jews saw it, and that you needed to believe in Jesus in order to be saved, is what happens. And they're also not opposed to power, not opposed, like that becomes the Holy Roman Empire, and becomes part of Roman understanding. Then Islam has an idea that you should submit to the will of God. With this part I hadn't talked about yet. That they're very clear on their monotheism. And they believe that the Jews and the Christians are people of the book and are holy people, and so therefore have special privileges. But that eventually, the hope is that they would eventually see the wisdom of Islam and of Muhammad as the final prophet in their view. And they also, in the process of spreading Islam, conquered large parts of the area that Jews live in, which ended up being a positive thing, because in the sense that it's a period of great intellectual learning, although eventually it'll lapse into intolerance. So those are big sweeping generalizations, of course. Your mileage may vary, but it gives you some sense of a Jewish view of the birth of these three religions. Questions? I've covered this so well, you're just stunned into silence. Or not. I mean, also you're welcome to ask questions later if you have questions, or it could be that it was actually clear enough that you don't need to keep going. So what we're going to do is take it off of recording and move into Hebrew, if there are no further comments or questions. Okay, ending recording now.